Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I've never been good with scary things. People who know me are always surprised when I admit that, because I'm a fairly large guy. But the truth is, I can't handle horror movies, haunted attractions, or anything that involves being scared. I avoid them whenever possible. If someone puts on a horror film, there's a good chance I'll spend half the movie staring at my phone instead of the screen. The strange thing is that despite hating fear, I've had several experiences throughout my life that I still can't fully explain. Whenever something unusual happened, I would try my best to forget about it as quickly as possible. I never wanted to dwell on it, because the more I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Yet some memories refuse to disappear. No matter how much time passes, they remain tucked away somewhere in the back of my mind. The earliest experiences happened when I was growing up in Poland. I lived in a small town bordering one of the largest forests in the region. Calling it a forest almost feels inadequate, because it was more like a wilderness, stretching endlessly in every direction. It spread across multiple counties and contained everything from rolling hills to dense woodland, marshes, streams, and clearings filled with wildflowers. It was beautiful. At the same time, it carried a heavy history. During the Second World War, parts of the forest had been used as burial grounds. Victims from concentration camps were buried there, and throughout the woods there were still traces of the past. Old ruins, damaged structures, forgotten foundations, and scars left behind by wartime bombardments could still be found if you wandered far enough. As teenagers, however, none of that really mattered to us. The forest was simply our playground. My friends and I spent countless hours hiking through it because we were the type of kids who could never sit still. If there was free time, we were outside. We explored trails, climbed hills, followed streams, and wandered so far from town that looking back now makes me question how our parents allowed it. One of the strangest things we repeatedly encountered was a staircase. Not a building, not a ruin, just a staircase. A completely isolated staircase standing deep within the forest. The first time we saw it, we assumed it had once belonged to a structure that had collapsed or been removed. That explanation seemed reasonable, until we started noticing where it appeared. Sometimes we would be 20 kilometers or more into the woods. There would be no roads, no signs of construction, no foundations, no evidence that a building had ever existed there. Yet occasionally we would come across a staircase standing alone. Every single time we avoided it. None of us ever approached it. We would simply stop, stare at it for a few moments, and continue walking. Looking back, I can't even explain why. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an instinctive feeling that we should leave it alone. Eventually, the staircase became one of those mysteries we never discussed too deeply. We saw it, acknowledged it, and kept moving. Years later, another experience in that same forest unsettled me even more. This time, I was alone. The day itself was beautiful. It was June. The weather was warm. The sky was clear. Birds were singing. Everything seemed perfect. Yet from the moment I entered the forest, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The feeling followed me for hours. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was anxiety. Everyone occasionally feels uneasy when alone in the wilderness. That explanation made sense. Still, the feeling wouldn't go away. I was walking along a broad path with open fields on one side and forest on the other. Every few minutes I found myself glancing over my shoulder, listening, searching the trees, expecting to see something. Nothing was ever there. Eventually, I became annoyed with myself. I was young, stubborn, and convinced I needed to prove that my fear was irrational. So instead of staying on the path, I deliberately entered the forest. If something was watching me, I wanted to find it. Of course, there was nothing there, at least not at first. For a while, everything seemed completely normal. Then, I came across a tree. I've seen countless trees in my life. This one was different. It stood in the middle of a younger forest. The surrounding trees were mostly birches, slender and healthy. But this tree was enormous. An ancient oak. Its trunk was massive. Its branches twisted outward like giant skeletal arms. The bark appeared blackened, not burned, just unnaturally dark. What caught my attention most, however, was the ground around it. The tree stood inside a perfect circle of dead grass. Everything within the circle appeared lifeless. Everything outside it appeared healthy. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I stepped closer, and immediately something changed. To this day, I don't know how to explain it. The weather seemed different. Only moments earlier, the forest had been bright and sunny. Inside that circle, it felt cloudy. The temperature seemed lower. The atmosphere felt heavier. Most unsettling of all, the birds stopped singing. The silence hit me instantly. One second, the forest was alive with sound. The next, it wasn't. I lasted perhaps 30 seconds before turning around and leaving. Whatever logical explanation existed didn't matter. My instincts were screaming at me to go. So I did. Fast. Several years later, when I was 17, another experience convinced me to stop wandering through remote forests altogether. My best friend was obsessed with history. Specifically, World War II history. He owned a metal detector and spent much of his free time searching old sites for artifacts. Coins, buttons, shell casings, broken equipment. Anything with historical value fascinated him. He was surprisingly good at it too. At one point, he even discovered the wreckage of a military aircraft and reported it to a local museum. One summer, he invited me on a hike to one of his favorite locations. The site had once been home to a German restaurant before the war ended. The building had long since been demolished, but remnants still remained. It was about 12 kilometers away through the forest. The hike itself was beautiful. Wildflowers covered open fields. Gentle hills rolled across the landscape. Birds filled the air with song. When we finally arrived, the area looked peaceful. The only obvious remains of the restaurant were an old concrete bridge and scattered debris hidden beneath the soil. My friend showed me places where he had dug before. He wasn't exaggerating. Everywhere we looked, there were fragments of history. Broken bottles, decorative plates, rusted utensils. Most of it had been damaged when the building was demolished decades earlier. For over an hour, we explored the area while my friend proudly displayed some of his discoveries. Eventually, we stood together on the old bridge. That's when we heard it. At first, it sounded like distant drumming. Neither of us paid much attention. There was a major road several kilometers away, so we assumed the sound was coming from traffic. But the drumming continued. Slow, rhythmic, steady. Several minutes passed. Instead of fading, it grew louder. Both of us stopped talking. We listened. The sound didn't resemble traffic anymore. It sounded deliberate, almost ceremonial. The louder it became, the more uncomfortable we felt. Eventually, my friend said exactly what I was thinking. There was no way a vehicle could be producing that sound. The road was too far away. The volume made no sense. The forest around us suddenly felt very different. The beautiful scenery no longer felt welcoming. It felt hostile. We exchanged a look. Then we ran. Neither of us suggested it. We simply started running at the same time. The drumming continued behind us. Loud, deep, relentless. About 10 minutes into our sprint, we noticed something strange. Several trees along the trail appeared broken, not fallen naturally, snapped, as though something enormous had twisted them in half. The problem was that those trees hadn't been there earlier. We had walked the exact same route on the way in. Neither of us remembered seeing them. That realization only increased our panic. We ran faster. The drumming never seemed to get farther away. Eventually, we burst from the forest onto a path leading toward a nearby village. That's when we saw the goat. Standing alone in an open field was a massive black mountain goat. Its horns curved upward like antlers. It wasn't grazing. It wasn't moving. It was simply standing there watching us. I don't know why that sight disturbed me so much. Maybe it was because of everything else that had happened. Maybe it was because seeing such an animal there felt unexpected. Whatever the reason, it scared us. After that day, neither of us returned. My friend eventually stopped exploring those woods entirely. Years later, I moved to the United Kingdom. I assumed those strange experiences were behind me. I was wrong. After getting my dog, I began taking long evening walks. Anyone who has spent a winter in the UK knows how quickly darkness arrives. By 5 in the afternoon, entire neighborhoods can already feel like midnight. At the time, I lived in a quiet village surrounded by open green spaces. The area was peaceful, safe, ordinary, yet several times over the course of a few years, I noticed something strange. A figure. Always distant, always standing beneath a street lamp. The first time I assumed it was a person, a neighbor perhaps, but the longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. The figure never moved, not once. It simply stood there, watching. At least that's how it felt. The clothing appeared loose and dark. A hood concealed the head. I couldn't tell whether it was male or female. Every time I walked my usual route, it would be there, standing beneath a different street lamp, watching from a distance. Rain, snow, wind, it didn't matter. The figure never seemed bothered, and it never moved. I never approached it. I never wanted to. Eventually, I moved away from that village. I hoped never to see it again. Then came the final experience. The one that frightened me more than any of the others. It happened roughly 2 years ago. My flatmates had left to visit family. I was alone. My dog had spent the evening stealing and consuming an entire block of cheddar cheese. An impressive achievement, honestly. Unfortunately, it also meant I needed to take her outside multiple times to make sure she wasn't going to become ill during the night. It was around 1 in the morning. The village felt strange from the moment we stepped outside. A thin fog covered everything. Not normal fog. It looked more like smoke. The streets were empty. Completely empty. Normally, there would still be occasional cars, distant voices, or lights in windows. That night, there was nothing. The village felt abandoned, almost artificial. Even the streetlights seemed wrong somehow, as though the entire world had become a stage set. The overwhelming feeling I experienced was simple. I felt like I was the only living person left. My dog and I continued walking. She seemed fine. The fog remained thick around us. Then it happened. A sound split the silence. I don't know how to accurately describe it. The closest comparison I can make is that it sounded like an animal being dragged alive through machinery. A high-pitched scream. Raw, painful, unnatural, the sound echoed through the darkness. My dog stopped instantly. Her ears lifted. Now here's the important detail. My dog has hearing issues. She normally doesn't react to high-pitched noises. Fireworks don't bother her. Many sounds that affect other dogs barely register with her. Yet she heard this, and the reaction terrified me. Without hesitation, she turned and bolted. Not walked, not trotted. Ran as fast as she could. The leash nearly ripped from my hand. Whatever she heard, it frightened her badly. I followed. There was absolutely no chance I was staying behind to investigate. By the time we reached home, she was shaking. Actually shaking. I locked every door immediately. Every window. Everything. Then I sat on my bed while she pressed herself against me. For over an hour, she remained terrified. I've never seen her behave that way before or since. I tried calling friends. No signal. Not one bar of service all night. Eventually, I fell asleep with every light in the house turned on, and my dog curled tightly against my side. I've never figured out what any of these experiences meant. Maybe there are logical explanations for all of them. Maybe there aren't. What I do know is that I still avoid horror movies. Because real life has already given me enough strange stories to last a lifetime. 2. There are some stories that stay with you not because of what happened, but because of how close someone came to something unimaginably horrible. This is one of those stories. I never met the woman involved personally. She was a friend of a friend, someone whose story eventually spread through a lot of social circles because of how disturbing it was. Over the years, I've heard details repeated by different people, and while some small parts may have changed, as stories often do, the core events have always remained the same. It began in a completely ordinary way. A night out. A bar. A conversation between two strangers. The woman met a man while she was out drinking with friends. Nothing seemed unusual about him. He wasn't behaving strangely. He wasn't making anyone uncomfortable. As far as she could tell, he was just another guy she'd met during a night out. They talked, got along well, and eventually he invited her back to his place for another drink. She agreed. At that point, there was no obvious reason not to. People do things like that every day. It's a normal part of dating and socializing. According to the story, they arrived at his house and spent some time talking and drinking. Everything appeared normal. Then, she started feeling strange. At first, it was probably easy to dismiss. Maybe she had had too much to drink. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. But the sensation kept getting worse. She realized something wasn't right. Eventually, she excused herself and went to the bathroom. That decision may have saved her life. The moment she was alone, she pulled out her phone and called emergency services. In my country, the emergency number is 112. She apparently managed to tell the dispatcher where she was. She gave the address. She tried explaining that something was wrong. Then, before she could finish the call, she lost consciousness. Most emergency dispatchers are trained to recognize when something doesn't sound right. The call suddenly ending wasn't treated as a simple disconnection. The dispatcher understood that there was likely a serious problem. Help was immediately sent to the address. Police responded. From what I was told, firefighters may have responded as well. Nobody knew exactly what they were walking into. Only that a woman had called for help and then suddenly stopped responding. When emergency crews arrived, they couldn't get anyone to answer the door. At that point, they made the decision to force entry. They broke the door open and went inside. What happened next became the part of the story that haunted the woman the most, because she didn't see any of it. Not at first. She was unconscious. At some point, while emergency personnel were carrying her out of the house, she began waking up. As consciousness returned, she realized something strange. There was a bag covering her head. She couldn't understand why. Imagine waking up from a terrifying situation only to find yourself being carried away with your vision completely blocked. Naturally, she became fixated on that detail afterward. Why had they covered her head? What was inside that house that they didn't want her to see? Nobody would give her a clear answer. Whether it was because of the ongoing investigation or simply an attempt to protect her. Authorities reportedly refused to explain exactly what had been found. At first, they thought they were helping. But the lack of answers created a different problem. The uncertainty became its own source of trauma. She knew something terrible had happened. She knew there was a reason emergency responders had covered her eyes, and because nobody would tell her what that reason was, her imagination filled in the blanks. Anyone who has experienced severe anxiety knows how dangerous that can be. The mind often creates scenarios worse than reality. Eventually, she began seeing a psychologist to help process everything that had happened. Yet the question continued haunting her. What had been inside that house? Why had she been shielded from it? The issue became so significant that the psychologist eventually intervened. According to the story, the psychologist argued that understanding the truth was important for her recovery. She couldn't process the trauma properly, while a giant unanswered question remained at the center of it. Eventually, authorities relented. They explained what responders had found when they entered the house. The explanation was horrifying. According to what was later revealed, nearly the entire interior of the house had been covered in plastic sheeting. Walls, furniture, large portions of the rooms. Everything prepared in a way that immediately raised alarm. And in the middle of the living room sat a table. Not an ordinary table. A table fitted with restraints. Straps designed to hold someone in place. Nearby was a collection of knives and various tools that investigators believed were intended for torture. The scene reportedly looked less like a home and more like a place specifically prepared for violence. At that moment, the reason for the bag became clear. Emergency responders weren't trying to punish her. They weren't trying to hide information from her forever. They simply didn't want her waking up and seeing a scene that would likely traumatize her even further. The implications were impossible to ignore. Investigators believed she had been drugged intentionally. The setup inside the house suggested planning, preparation, purpose. This wasn't a random situation that had spiraled out of control. The man appeared to have created an environment specifically designed for prolonged violence. And if emergency services hadn't arrived when they did, the outcome could have been unimaginably different. That's the part that always stays with me. How close she came. A few minutes later, a dispatcher who didn't take the call seriously. An address not communicated clearly. A delayed response. Any one of those things could have changed the ending completely. Yet somehow she managed to make that call before losing consciousness. And somehow the dispatcher recognized the danger in time. What makes the story even more disturbing is what happened afterward. According to what I was told, the man received surprisingly little punishment compared to what people expected. Because of the way the law worked and what investigators could definitively prove, much of what they believed he intended to do remained exactly that: intent, belief, suspicion, potential future harm. The most serious conviction reportedly ended up relating to the drugging itself. Whether that's entirely accurate or whether details became distorted over time, I honestly don't know. But that's how the story was always told. And for the woman involved, the result felt deeply unfair. Because after everything happened, she still had to live in the same city. Still had to exist knowing that somewhere nearby was a man she believed had intended to do something horrific to her. That's a difficult thing to comprehend. Most people imagine survival as the end of the story. The danger passes. The criminal is caught. Life returns to normal. Reality isn't usually that simple. Surviving is only the beginning. Afterward comes the fear, the anxiety, the memories, the constant awareness of what almost happened. What makes this story particularly unsettling isn't just the violence that may have been planned. It's how ordinary everything seemed at the start. A conversation in a bar, a drink, a night that looked completely normal. Then one decision led her into a situation she may not have survived without a single phone call. Years later, I heard another story from a neighboring country that sounded disturbingly similar. Different people, different location. Yet many of the details felt almost identical. I've often wondered whether the cases were somehow connected, or whether the similarities were simply coincidence. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that every time I hear someone say they're worried about calling emergency services because they might be overreacting, I think about stories like this. Because sometimes trusting your instincts and making that call can be the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor. Some memories become strange over time. At first, they seem simple enough. You remember exactly what happened, exactly where you were standing, and exactly who was with you. Then, years pass, and you realize that the memory doesn't make sense anymore. This is one of those memories for me. Even now, years later, my partner and I still occasionally bring it up. Neither of us has ever come up with an explanation. When I was 17 years old, I went through one of the hardest experiences of my life. The house I had grown up in, the only home I had ever known, was being sold. For most people, moving is stressful. For me, it felt like losing a piece of my identity. The house had belonged to my family for as long as I could remember. Every room held memories. Every hallway felt familiar. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every window that stuck during the winter, every strange little corner that had fascinated me as a child. But circumstances had changed. My relatives had decided it was time to sell. My 90-year-old aunt, who had lived there for years, was moving into a care home. There wasn't really a choice. The decision had been made. All that was left was packing. The atmosphere in the house felt strange during those final days. Rooms that had once been full of furniture and family possessions slowly became empty. Pictures disappeared from walls. Closets emptied. Shelves that had been packed with decades of belongings stood bare. The more things we removed, the less the house felt like home. It felt like a shell. Like the building itself was slowly becoming a stranger. My partner helped me through much of it. Without them, I probably would have spent most of the time being emotional rather than productive. Together we sorted boxes, carried furniture, and tried to make sense of a lifetime of accumulated possessions. As we got closer to finishing, there was one place we hadn't really explored much: the basement. The basement had always been unsettling, not because anything bad had ever happened there. It simply had that feeling old basements sometimes have. Cold, dim, silent. The kind of place where every sound seems louder than it should. The kind of place where shadows seem deeper than normal. As a kid, I never liked spending much time down there. Even at 17, I wasn't exactly excited about exploring it. But with my partner there, I felt brave enough. By that point, most of the house was empty anyway. We figured it was worth taking one last look around before everything was gone forever. So we headed downstairs. The basement felt even stranger than usual. Without boxes, furniture, and years of clutter, it seemed larger somehow. The emptiness amplified every sound. Our footsteps echoed. The air felt cold. Not unusually cold for a basement, just cold enough to make the place uncomfortable. As we looked around, we came across a small storage area. Inside was my aunt's old sewing machine. There were a few other odds and ends scattered around, but one thing immediately caught our attention. A large shelving unit. It was heavy. Old, the kind of thing that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. Behind it, partially visible through the gap, was something neither of us expected. A door. Not a modern door. An old door. The kind you see in very old houses. I remember noticing the lock immediately. It had one of those old-fashioned skeleton key keyholes. The kind that instantly makes you wonder what's on the other side. The discovery felt strange. I had lived in that house my entire life. How had I never noticed this before? My partner was just as curious. We squeezed closer and tried to get a better look. The door looked real. Solid, old, partially hidden behind the shelf, but clearly there. Naturally, I reached for the knob. It turned slightly, then stopped. Locked. I tried again. Same result. The door wasn't opening. That only made us more curious. The shelving unit blocked most of it, and despite our efforts, we couldn't move it. It was simply too heavy. Eventually, we gave up. We figured we'd come back later with help and move the shelf properly. At the very least, we wanted to know what was behind the door. The rest of the day passed normally. That evening, while talking with my mother, I mentioned what we'd found. To my surprise, she looked genuinely confused. A hidden door? In the basement? She said she'd never heard of it. That immediately caught my attention. If anyone should have known about it, surely it would have been her. The conversation quickly shifted from curiosity to excitement. Now all three of us wanted to see it. So we headed back downstairs. I remember feeling eager, partly because I wanted to show her, partly because I wanted confirmation that what we'd seen was real. We walked into the same area, approached the same shelf, and stopped. The door was gone. Not hidden, not covered. Gone. Behind the shelving unit was nothing but a solid concrete wall. I remember standing there staring at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. The shelf hadn't moved. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing appeared different. Except for one impossible detail. The door no longer existed. I immediately looked at my partner. They looked just as confused as I felt. We both knew what we'd seen earlier. We had stood there together. We had examined the door. I had touched the knob. We had discussed coming back later. Yet now there was only concrete. My mother naturally assumed we had mistaken something. Maybe a shadow. Maybe a recess in the wall. Maybe some visual trick created by poor lighting, but neither of us believed that. Not then. Not now. The memory is too specific. I can still picture the keyhole. I can still remember reaching for the knob. I can still remember the feeling of disappointment when it wouldn't open. Those aren't details that fit a vague misunderstanding. Over the years, I've tried to come up with explanations. Maybe stress played a role. After all, I was going through an emotional period. Maybe my memory has distorted events. Maybe there was some architectural feature that looked like a door under certain conditions. Maybe, but every explanation runs into the same problem. My partner remembers it too, not just generally, specifically the door, the lock, the shelf. the entire sequence of events. We both saw the same thing, and we both remember returning later to find a concrete wall where that door had supposedly been. That's why the memory has never faded. It's not because I think we discovered a portal to another dimension. It's not because I believe the house was haunted. It's because I genuinely don't know what happened. Most mysteries eventually become less mysterious with time. You gain perspective. You find an explanation. The puzzle pieces finally fit together. This one never did. The house is gone from my life now. My aunt is gone. The belongings have long since been sorted and scattered. The chaos of that period exists only in memory. Yet every now and then my partner and I still bring up the basement, the old shelf, the hidden door, and the concrete wall that replaced it. Neither of us has ever changed our story. Neither of us has ever stopped believing we saw it, which leaves us with a mystery that has lasted far longer than the house itself. A door that appeared, refused to open, and then somehow vanished as though it had never been there at all. I've had a couple of experiences in my life that still bother me years later. Neither one has a satisfying explanation. Neither one ended with some dramatic revelation. They're simply strange memories that occasionally pop back into my head when I'm lying awake at night. The first happened when I was in my mid-20s. My wife and I had just moved from Europe back to the United States. The whole process happened incredibly fast. One minute we were living overseas, and the next we were packing our lives into boxes and starting over on another continent. Moving is stressful under the best circumstances, but this move felt like a whirlwind. There were flights to catch, paperwork to complete, housing arrangements to sort out, bank accounts, utilities, everything that comes with rebuilding a life somewhere new. After we arrived in the US, one of the first things we needed to do was get mobile phones. This was before smartphones completely took over everyday life, but having a phone was still essential. So we went to a store, picked up new phones, activated new numbers, and crossed another item off our growing checklist. At that point, nobody knew my new number. Nobody. We had only been in the country for a matter of hours. I hadn't given the number to family. I hadn't given it to friends. I hadn't updated any accounts. The only person who knew it was my wife, because she had been standing right next to me when we got it. Afterward, we decided to relax. The move had been exhausting. We went out, had a couple of drinks, enjoyed the fact that the hardest part was finally behind us, and eventually headed home. By the time we got back, I was exhausted. I went to sleep almost immediately. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and noticed something strange. Several missed calls. At first, I assumed it was some kind of spam call. Wrong numbers happen all the time. Telemarketers happen all the time. It didn't seem particularly important. Then I noticed there was a voicemail. Curious, I pressed play, and immediately felt uncomfortable. The recording contained a voice, a person, not a machine, not a robocall, just someone speaking. Or more accurately, whispering. The caller wasn't having a conversation. They weren't leaving a message. They weren't asking for someone. Instead, they were simply repeating my name, over and over. The same name, again and again and again, for nearly a minute. The voice sounded weak, almost pleading, a kind of whimpering tone, not angry, not threatening, just unsettling. The entire message was basically my name repeated dozens of times. Nothing else. No explanation, no reason, no identification, just my name. I remember replaying it several times because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was hearing. Then came the obvious question. How? How did anyone even have that number? We had only gotten it the day before. The only person who knew it was my wife. The entire thing made absolutely no sense. To this day, I have no explanation. Maybe the number had previously belonged to someone else. Maybe someone was trying to reach the former owner. Maybe there was some perfectly logical reason buried somewhere in the background. But none of those explanations ever felt completely satisfying. Not because of the call itself, because of the voicemail, because whoever left it knew my name. Years later, I still occasionally think about it. Not because I believe it was supernatural, just because it was incredibly strange. The second experience was much more frightening. Unlike the phone call, I know exactly what happened. The mystery isn't whether it occurred. The mystery is what the person's intentions were. This happened in my first apartment. It wasn't a terrible place. Small, affordable, located near the edge of town. One side of the property bordered a semi-wooded area that stretched off into patches of trees and undeveloped land. During the day, it was peaceful. At night, it could feel isolated. My apartment was on the ground floor. That detail becomes important. Ground floor bedrooms always come with a certain vulnerability. There's something unsettling about knowing that anyone outside can potentially stand right next to your window. Most of the time, you don't think about it. Until someone actually does. One night I was in bed when I became aware of movement outside. At first, I wasn't sure what I'd heard. Maybe an animal. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe someone walking by. But as the minutes passed, it became increasingly clear that someone was outside my bedroom window. Not passing by. Staying there. Watching, I remained still for a while, listening. Eventually, I became certain of something else. Whoever was outside knew that I knew they were there. There was no ambiguity anymore. Yet they still weren't leaving. That was the moment things shifted from strange to genuinely creepy. My bedroom had 2 windows positioned on different walls. After a while, I realized the person was moving between them. One moment, I'd hear movement near one window. Then a few minutes later, near the other. Back and forth. Back and forth. Slowly, deliberately, I tried catching a glimpse of them. Every time I lifted the blinds and looked outside, they would move out of sight. Not run. Not flee. Simply step away. As if they were actively avoiding being seen. That continued for several minutes, long enough for my anxiety to transform into anger. Because fear only lasts so long before frustration takes over. I was tired. I was annoyed. And I was getting increasingly fed up with someone lurking around outside my bedroom in the middle of the night. Eventually, I reached my limit. I grabbed a baseball bat, marched to the front door, and threw it open. Then I did something that was probably equal parts brave and stupid. I charged outside screaming. Not a tactical plan, not a carefully considered strategy, just pure frustration. I remember yelling that they were messing with the wrong person and running toward the side of the building. The reaction was immediate. The person bolted. The moment they realized someone was actually coming after them, they took off running. Within seconds, they disappeared into the darkness. I never got a good look at them, never figured out who they were, never saw them again. But afterward, I started thinking about something. The previous tenant of that apartment had been a young woman, an attractive young woman, according to neighbors. And suddenly the entire situation seemed a lot less random. I started wondering whether the person had been returning out of habit. Maybe a peeping Tom. Maybe a stalker. Maybe someone who expected the previous tenant to still be living there. Whatever the explanation, they clearly weren't expecting a 6-foot-tall guy carrying a baseball bat to come charging out of the building. And honestly, that's probably the only reason the situation ended as quickly as it did. Of the two stories, the second one is definitely scarier. At least with the phone call, nobody was physically present. The voice remained trapped inside a voicemail. The person outside my apartment was real. Close enough to touch the walls. Close enough to watch the windows. Close enough to remind me how vulnerable we sometimes are without realizing it. Both experiences happened years ago. Both ended without answers, and both still occasionally pop into my head when I'm trying to sleep. The voicemail because it was impossible to explain. The visitor because they were impossible to identify. And sometimes the unanswered questions are what linger the longest. Some memories stay with you for a lifetime. Not because they were dramatic when they happened, not because you knew they would become important, but because years later, after everything is over, you realize that a perfectly ordinary moment was actually the last time you would ever see someone alive. This happened to me in high school. More than 30 years have passed, and I still think about it. There was a girl in my math class who sat at the desk next to mine in the back of the room. She was very quiet, not unfriendly, just quiet. The kind of student who came to class, did her work, and rarely drew attention to herself. Most people probably couldn't have told you much about her. She wasn't part of the popular crowd. She wasn't loud. She wasn't involved in school drama. She mostly kept to herself. Even though we sat next to each other, we didn't talk much. Occasionally she'd say something about class. Sometimes we'd exchange a few words before the bell rang. Nothing significant. Just the small conversations that happen naturally when two people spend months sitting beside one another. Looking back, I realize I didn't know very much about her at all. I knew her name. I knew she was quiet. And I knew she seemed like a genuinely nice person. That's about it. Then came a Friday afternoon that I can still remember with surprising clarity. Class was ending. Students were packing up their books. People were already thinking about the weekend. The room was filled with the usual noise of chairs scraping across the floor and conversations starting up as everyone prepared to leave. As I was gathering my things, she suddenly spoke to me. That alone caught my attention because she rarely initiated conversations. She looked at me and said, "I need to tell you something, but I can't right now. I'll tell you on Monday." I remember thinking it was an odd thing to say. Not alarming, not frightening, just unusual. Most people don't announce that they have something important to tell you and then refuse to tell you what it is. Naturally, I was curious. But I wasn't overly concerned. At the time, it felt like one of those things that could wait. Maybe she wanted advice about something. Maybe she wanted to talk about a personal issue. Maybe she simply didn't want to discuss it in a crowded classroom. There were 100 possible explanations. So I shrugged and said something simple. "Okay, tell me on Monday." She nodded. Then she left the classroom. At the time, there was nothing remarkable about that moment. No sense of finality. No feeling that anything was wrong. It was just the end of another school day. The last thing I ever said to her. The weekend came and went. Monday arrived. I remember sitting in class and noticing her desk was empty. That wasn't completely unusual. Students missed school all the time. People got sick. People had appointments. People skipped class. I didn't think much of it. I assumed she'd be back the next day. After all, she had something she wanted to tell me. Tuesday came. Her desk was still empty. This time, people started talking. Rumors began spreading through the school. Teachers looked uncomfortable. Students whispered to one another in the hallways. Something had happened. Then, we learned the truth. She wasn't absent. She wasn't sick. She wasn't coming back. Over the weekend, she had been murdered. According to what we were told, her boyfriend had killed her. The details were devastating. A jealous boyfriend. A violent act. A young life ended before it had really begun. I remember the shock that spread through the school. For many students, it was the first time death had become real. Not an elderly relative, not someone far away in the news. Someone we knew. Someone who had been sitting in class with us only days earlier. Someone who had walked the same hallways and sat in the same desks. One moment she was there. The next, she was gone. As awful as the tragedy itself was, one particular detail became impossible for me to stop thinking about. Her final words to me. "I need to tell you something, but I can't right now. I'll tell you on Monday." For years I've wondered what she wanted to say. Maybe it was nothing important. Maybe it was something completely ordinary. Maybe it had nothing whatsoever to do with what happened later. Logically, I know that's entirely possible. But the human mind doesn't always care about logic. When something like this happens, your thoughts naturally drift toward the unanswered questions. What was it? Why couldn't she tell me right then? Why did it have to wait until Monday? Would she have told someone else if she'd had the chance? Did it matter? Did it not matter at all? I'll never know. And that's the hardest part. There is no answer coming. No explanation. No opportunity years later to finally satisfy the curiosity. Whatever she intended to tell me disappeared with her. Sometimes I imagine it was something simple. A secret crush. A problem at home. A question about school. Something completely unrelated to the tragedy that followed. Other times I wonder if she was trying to reach out, trying to tell someone something she hadn't been able to say out loud before. The truth is that I'll never know which possibility is correct. More than 30 years have passed since that Friday afternoon. I've lived an entire lifetime since then. Yet every now and then, I'll think about that classroom. The back row. The sound of students packing up their books. The girl sitting beside me, and those final words. Not because I believe I could have changed what happened. Not because I think I somehow failed her. But because certain moments become frozen in time. You replay them endlessly, searching for meaning that may not exist. The older I get, the more I understand that some questions never get answers. Some stories end in the middle of a sentence. Some conversations never happen, and some people leave behind mysteries that stay with us far longer than they ever could have imagined. All these years later, I still wish I knew what she wanted to tell me. And I suspect I always will. Some stories stay with you because they're frightening. Others stay with you because they're tragic. And then there are stories that stay with you because they force you to confront the absolute worst things human beings have ever done to one another. This is one of those stories. A few years ago, I was listening to an episode of the radio program This American Life, featuring writer and storyteller Etgar Keret. The episode itself covered several aspects of his life and family history, but one particular story has never left me. Even now, years later, I find myself thinking about it unexpectedly. Sometimes when I see a parent holding a child, sometimes when I hear discussions about World War II, sometimes for no reason at all. The story involved Etgar Keret's mother and grandmother during the Holocaust. When Etgar's mother was nearing the end of her own life, she reportedly spoke about finally seeing her mother again. Her mother had been murdered during World War II. The circumstances of that death were almost impossible to imagine. According to the story, Etgar's grandmother had been trying to escape during a Nazi roundup inside a Jewish ghetto. She was running for her life. Not alone. She had her children with her. Among them was Etgar's mother, who was still a young girl at the time. At some point during the chase, they found themselves on the rooftops of buildings. For a brief moment, those rooftops offered a chance of escape. A chance to stay ahead of the soldiers pursuing them. They ran from roof to roof, trying to survive, trying to find some way out, trying to stay alive one more day. But eventually they ran out of places to go. The path ahead disappeared. The soldiers were closing in. And Etgar's grandmother realized something terrible. She wasn't going to make it. She had another child with her as well. A baby. She knew she couldn't outrun armed soldiers while carrying an infant. The situation had become hopeless. Faced with an impossible choice, she turned to her daughter. She told her to jump. The next building was close enough. If she jumped, she might survive. If she stayed, she almost certainly wouldn't. She reportedly told her daughter to keep running. Not to stop, not to look back. Just run. Any parent can understand what must have been going through her mind in that moment. She wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about her child, about giving her at least a chance to live. So Etgar's mother jumped. She made it across. But instead of continuing to run, she hid nearby. She couldn't leave. She couldn't force herself to abandon her mother completely. So she stayed hidden and watched. What happened next became a memory she carried for the rest of her life. The soldiers reached her mother. They shot her. There was no escape, no rescue, no miracle. Her mother died there on the rooftop. But the story didn't end there, and that's the part that has haunted me ever since I heard it. According to the account, her mother had been holding the baby during those final moments. The soldiers were now left with an infant, a helpless child, a baby who posed no threat to anyone, a baby who couldn't understand what was happening, a baby who had already lost his mother. What happened next was an act of cruelty so extreme that it almost feels impossible to comprehend. According to the story, the soldiers didn't want to waste ammunition. Instead, they killed the child by smashing him against a wall. A baby, a completely defenseless infant, murdered because the people responsible viewed him as less than human. When I first heard the story, I had a baby of my own. That detail changed everything. Before becoming a parent, stories like this are tragic. After becoming a parent, they become something else entirely. You stop hearing about historical events. You start imagining real people. You picture your own child. You imagine holding them, protecting them, feeding them, comforting them. And suddenly stories that once felt distant become unbearable. I remember listening in silence, unable to stop thinking about it, unable to move past that image. Because earlier in the same episode, Etgar had described his grandmother breastfeeding while trying to keep her children alive during the war. That detail made her feel real, not a historical figure, not a victim in a history book, a mother. A woman doing everything she could to protect her children. A woman trying to keep a baby alive under impossible circumstances. And then hearing what happened afterward made the story infinitely more painful. What haunts me most isn't just the violence, it's the contrast. One moment she's caring for her child, feeding him, protecting him, carrying him. The next moment both their lives are taken away. And all of it witnessed by a young girl who would carry those memories forever. It's easy to talk about wars in terms of battles, armies, and political decisions. History books often reduce enormous suffering to dates and statistics. Millions dead, thousands displaced, entire populations destroyed. But stories like this remind you that every number was a person. Every victim had a family. Every child had a mother. Every mother had dreams for her children. When you focus on a single family, the scale of the tragedy becomes easier to understand, because suddenly it's no longer a statistic. It's a mother making an impossible decision. A daughter hiding nearby. A baby who never had a chance to grow up. And a memory that survived long after everyone involved was gone. Years have passed since I first heard that interview. I don't remember every detail of the episode anymore. I don't remember every story Edgar Carrot told. But I remember that one perfectly. Not because it's the most graphic thing I've ever heard. Not because it's the most shocking. But because it represents something fundamentally horrifying about humanity. The ability of ordinary people to become capable of extraordinary cruelty. And the fact that the victims were often completely innocent. Every now and then the story comes back into my mind, usually when I least expect it. And every time it does, I find myself thinking about that mother on the rooftop. About the decision she had to make. About the daughter she managed to save, and about the child she couldn't. Some stories fade with time. This one never has, and I suspect it never will. A few months ago, my husband was away for the weekend, leaving me alone in our house with our dog Baloo. We live in a large single-family home in the countryside, surrounded by fields and patches of woodland. During the day, it's peaceful and beautiful. At night, however, it can feel very isolated. I've never liked being alone in the house overnight. Nothing bad had ever happened there before. But when you're surrounded by darkness, and there aren't many neighbors nearby, every unusual sound seems louder than it should. The only thing that made me feel better was having Baloo with me. He was a large dog, loyal and protective, and his presence always made the house feel less empty. That night seemed completely normal. I went to bed at my usual time, and before long I was asleep. Then, sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke up. At first, I wasn't entirely sure what had disturbed me. I lay there for a few seconds listening. Then I heard it again. A faint scratching sound. Slow, soft, almost like something scraping against wood. I'm an extremely light sleeper, so even small noises tend to wake me up. Still half asleep, I assumed it was probably an animal outside. We occasionally hear martins, birds, or other wildlife around the property. The sound seemed distant enough that I wasn't immediately worried. My first thought was that maybe I'd left a window open and some animal was scratching near the house. So I got out of bed. The room was dark except for a little moonlight coming through the curtains. I walked toward the window intending to close it. But when I reached it, I realized something strange. The window was already shut. Completely shut. I stood there for a moment, confused. Then I listened more carefully. The scratching wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. That realization immediately woke me up. My first assumption was Baloo. I figured he was scratching at the bedroom door because he wanted to come in. That wouldn't have been unusual. Sometimes he'd wander around at night and decide he'd rather sleep near me. Feeling relieved that I'd probably solved the mystery, I opened the bedroom door. The living room was dimly lit by a little moonlight filtering through the windows, and there was Baloo, lying in his bed, wide awake. His ears were standing straight up, and he was staring directly at me. Not scratching, not moving, just staring. The moment I saw him, my stomach tightened, because the scratching sound was still there, and now it seemed louder, much louder. I switched on the living room light. The sound immediately became easier to locate. It wasn't coming from the floor. It wasn't coming from a door. It wasn't coming from the ceiling. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall itself. I stood frozen, listening. The scratching continued. Slow, deliberate, almost as if something was moving inside the wall. My mind immediately started racing through possible explanations. A rat, a squirrel, some kind of animal trapped between the walls. Yet something about the sound felt wrong. I can't explain why. It simply did. Then Balu reacted. Without warning, he jumped to his feet. A low growl rolled out of his throat. The kind of growl dog owners instantly recognize. Not playful, not curious. A warning. He moved toward the wall and started scratching at it aggressively. My fear immediately intensified. If Balu was concerned, maybe I should be too. I remembered my sister, who lives next door with her family. Before my husband left for the weekend, she had told me not to hesitate to call if I needed anything. I figured that since it was a weekend night, there was a chance she might still be awake. So I decided to call her. Trying to stay calm, I walked back into the bedroom to get my phone. The scratching continued. Balu remained agitated. I picked up my phone and was just about to dial. Then everything changed. Balu suddenly exploded into barking. Loud, violent, relentless, the kind of barking that immediately signals a threat. I ran back into the living room. This time, he wasn't facing the wall anymore. He was standing at the far end of the room. Rigid, focused, looking straight into the dark hallway leading deeper into the house. The hallway was completely black. Nothing moved. Nothing visible stood there. Yet Balu couldn't take his eyes off it. I called his name, told him to stop. He ignored me completely. Then, without warning, he charged into the darkness. For a second, everything went silent. Then I heard a crash. A loud, violent crash from somewhere near the staircase. The sound echoed through the house. My heart nearly stopped. At that moment, I became convinced someone was inside. Nothing else made sense. Someone had broken in. Someone was in the hallway. Someone was somewhere inside the house. I called desperately for Balu. A few moments later, he came running back. But something was wrong. He wasn't barking anymore. He wasn't growling. He was whimpering. I immediately shut the bedroom door behind us. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone. I called emergency services and told the dispatcher that I believed there was an intruder in my house. The police were dispatched immediately. Then the house went silent, completely silent. The scratching had stopped, the barking had stopped, the crashing had stopped. The only sound left was Balu quietly whining beside me. Trying to calm him down, I sat next to him and gently ran my hand along his back. That's when I felt something wet. At first, I thought it might be mud. Then my hand came away covered in blood. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. There was blood everywhere. I looked closer. A large wound ran along his side. An open wound. Deep enough to terrify me instantly. I felt physically sick. I didn't want to leave the room. I didn't want to move away from the locked door. But I knew I had to stop the bleeding. I grabbed shirts, towels, anything I could find. Then I pressed them against the wound as firmly as I could. Balu remained surprisingly calm despite everything. He simply lay beside me, trembling. The wait for the police felt endless. Every minute seemed like an hour. I kept expecting to hear footsteps, or another crash, or the scratching to start again, but nothing happened. Finally, the police arrived. The house was searched from top to bottom, every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. At the same time, Baloo was rushed to an emergency veterinary clinic. When the search was finished, the officers delivered news that somehow made everything even more unsettling. They hadn't found anyone. No intruder. No evidence of forced entry. No broken locks. No open windows. Nothing. Every entrance to the house was secure. According to the officers, there was no indication that anyone had entered the property at all. I couldn't understand it. I knew what I'd heard. I knew how Baloo had reacted. And I knew he had somehow suffered a serious injury. Yet there was no explanation. That night, I refused to stay in the house. Instead, I spent the remainder of the night at my sister's place next door. Thankfully, Baloo survived. The veterinarians cleaned and stitched the wound, and over time he made a full recovery. Today, he's healthy, happy, and completely back to normal. But even the veterinarian couldn't fully explain the injury. The wound appeared to have been caused by a significant external force. According to the vet, it resembled the type of damage sometimes seen when an animal is struck or slashed by something with large claws. That explanation only created more questions. What could possibly have happened inside a locked house? How did the scratching start? What made Baloo charge into the hallway? What caused the crash? And most importantly, what injured him? To this day, none of those questions have answers. Years later, the memory still feels vivid. The scratching in the wall, the dark hallway, the sudden silence, and the moment I realized my dog was covered in blood. Maybe there's a perfectly logical explanation hidden somewhere in the details. Maybe there always was. But I've never found it. And every time I think about that night, I still feel the same cold shiver run down my spine. This isn't my story personally, but it's one that a friend told me years ago, and I've never forgotten it. He's not someone who normally makes things up. He's not the type to exaggerate. In fact, he's usually the first person to look for a logical explanation when something strange happens. That's part of why the story always stuck with me. According to him, it happened when he was younger. His grandmother lived alone in an old house that had been in the family for many years. The place wasn't necessarily abandoned or run down, but it had the kind of atmosphere that immediately makes you uneasy. You know the sort of house. The floors creak. The hallways seem darker than they should. Every room feels like it has decades of memories trapped inside it. Nothing visibly wrong, just a feeling. My friend's mother needed to spend a few days there helping his grandmother with some things, but she didn't want to stay alone. She had never outright said she was afraid of the house, but she clearly didn't enjoy being there by herself. So she asked her son to come along. He agreed. At the time, he thought she was just being overly cautious. After all, it was his grandmother's house. What was there to be afraid of? When they arrived, everything seemed normal enough. His grandmother was happy to see them. The day passed without incident. They ate dinner, talked for a while, and eventually started getting ready for bed. Because there weren't enough spare bedrooms available, my friend ended up sleeping on the couch in the living room. He didn't mind. He was young, and sleeping on a couch for a night or two wasn't a big deal. The living room connected to a long hallway that led toward the bedrooms and bathroom. From where he was lying, he couldn't see very far down the hallway, especially once all the lights were turned off. The house became completely quiet. At some point during the night, he woke up. He wasn't sure why. Maybe a noise had disturbed him. Maybe he had simply drifted into that half-awake state people sometimes experience. Either way, he found himself lying there in the darkness. Then, he heard footsteps. Slow footsteps. Someone walking down the hallway. At first, he wasn't concerned. The obvious explanation was that it was his mother. Maybe she'd gotten up to use the bathroom. Maybe she couldn't sleep. Whatever the reason, it seemed completely normal. Not wanting her to realize he was still awake, he closed his eyes. Kids do that sometimes. Even when they're awake, they pretend to be asleep so adults will leave them alone. So he kept his eyes shut and listened. The footsteps continued. One step, then another, then another. Instead of passing by, they seemed to be getting closer. Closer to the living room, closer to the couch. He still wasn't worried. He assumed his mother had simply come to check on him before heading back to bed. The footsteps eventually stopped, right beside the couch. He remained perfectly still, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. Then, something happened that immediately made him uncomfortable. He felt someone leaning over him, not touching him, just standing above him, close enough that he could sense their presence, close enough that he could feel their breath. He described it as a faint sensation of warm air against his forehead. At first, he assumed his mother was checking to see whether he was asleep. Maybe she was about to give him a goodnight kiss. Maybe she was adjusting a blanket. Something completely ordinary. But she didn't do anything. There was just silence and breathing for several seconds, maybe longer. Then he felt the figure straighten up. The footsteps began again, slowly moving away, back toward the hallway. Eventually the sounds disappeared completely. At some point afterward, he finally fell asleep. The next morning, the experience didn't seem particularly frightening. Strange, maybe, but not frightening. Over breakfast, he casually mentioned it to his mother. He asked why she had come out during the night to check on him. According to him, her reaction was immediate. She looked confused, then concerned. She told him she had never left her room. Not once. In fact, she admitted something she'd never mentioned before. The entire night she had felt uncomfortable. Not because of a specific noise, not because she'd seen anything, just because something about the house felt wrong. She said she'd stayed inside her room the entire time because she didn't like the atmosphere. She never went into the hallway. She never checked on him. She never approached the couch. At first he thought she was joking. Then he realized she was completely serious. The realization hit him hard. Because if his mother wasn't the one standing over him, then who was? Or what was? That's the question that stayed with him ever since. Not the footsteps, not the breathing. The question, because if he had opened his eyes in that moment, he would have seen whoever or whatever was leaning over him. And to this day, he isn't sure whether he's grateful or disappointed that he didn't. Part of him desperately wants to know. The other part suspects he wouldn't have liked the answer. Several months later, his grandmother passed away. The family returned to the house to sort through her belongings and prepare the property for sale. This time, things felt different. The house itself hadn't changed. The furniture was still there. The same rooms, the same hallways, the same staircase. During the day, everything seemed perfectly normal. Sunlight filled the windows. People moved around packing boxes and sharing memories. The house almost felt welcoming. But as evening approached, the atmosphere changed. At least according to my friend and his mother. The moment darkness started settling outside, that familiar feeling returned. The uneasiness, the tension, the sense that the house somehow became a different place after sunset. Neither of them talked about it initially, but both were clearly uncomfortable. As night approached, they eventually admitted they were thinking the same thing. Neither one wanted to sleep there. Not after what had happened. Not after the strange feeling that seemed to linger inside those walls. Instead, they packed up for the night and checked into a nearby motel. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There were no strange noises, no apparitions, no doors slamming shut, just a shared feeling that they didn't want to spend another night in that house. Even now, years later, my friend occasionally talks about it. Not because he claims to know what happened. He doesn't. He freely admits there may be a perfectly rational explanation. Maybe he dreamed it. Maybe he misheard something. Maybe his memory has changed over time. But one part of the story never leaves him. The feeling of someone standing over him. The sensation of breathing on his forehead. And the knowledge that he kept his eyes shut the entire time. Because whenever he remembers that night, the same thought always comes back. What would he have seen if he'd opened them? This is one of those memories that didn't seem particularly disturbing at the time. In fact, when it happened, I barely thought about it. It was only years later, after learning who was really standing in front of our class every day, that the memory became something much darker. Even now, whenever I think about it, I get an uncomfortable feeling. The kind of feeling that makes your stomach tighten. The kind of realization that only comes with hindsight. This happened when I was in middle school. Part of our physical education program included a swimming unit. Like most kids, I didn't think much about it. It was just another class. Another part of the school day. One day, when our class walked into the pool area, something immediately stood out. There was a video camera set up on a tripod beside the pool. Back then, that wasn't something you saw every day. The camera was positioned so it could clearly record the entire swimming area. Most of us noticed it right away. The day before, our teacher had given us special instructions. He told us to bring a set of old baggy clothes, things like oversized shirts, sweatpants, and other loose clothing. According to him, we were going to learn an important survival skill. The purpose of the lesson was to show us what it felt like to swim while wearing heavy clothing. His explanation actually sounded reasonable. He told us that if we ever accidentally fell into water while fully dressed, the experience would be very different from swimming in a bathing suit. The extra weight would affect how we moved. The wet fabric would drag us down. Learning how to handle that situation could potentially be useful one day. At the time, nobody questioned it. It seemed like a legitimate exercise, so we followed the instructions. Underneath our clothes, we were all wearing normal swimsuits. The lesson started. We entered the pool fully dressed and spent the class swimming laps, treading water, and practicing different techniques while wearing the soaked clothing. The entire time, the camera continued recording. I remember noticing it occasionally while swimming, not because I was particularly concerned, just because it felt unusual. Most classes weren't filmed. When someone eventually asked why he was recording everything, he had an answer ready. He told us he recorded the lesson every year. According to him, he saved the videos and later gave them back to students when they became seniors in high school. The idea, he said, was that years later we'd be able to watch ourselves struggling around in oversized wet clothing and laugh about how awkward we looked. As kids, that explanation seemed believable. A little strange, maybe, but believable. The class ended. We climbed out of the pool. Then we removed the wet clothing while still wearing our swimsuits underneath. Nothing about the situation seemed especially alarming at the time. Life moved on. The recording became just another forgotten memory from middle school. Still, there was one thing that always bothered me slightly, even back then. My older sister had gone through the exact same swimming program. She had attended the same school, taken the same class, had the same teacher, and she'd graduated several years before me. Yet she had never received any recording. Neither had any of the seniors she knew. Whenever the subject came up, nobody seemed to remember ever getting these supposed videos. The teacher had been working there for a very long time, at least 15 or 20 years from what I remember. If he truly recorded every class every year and gave the videos back to students later, surely someone would have received one by now. Yet nobody ever had. As a kid, I found it odd, but not alarming enough to think much more about it. After all, adults do strange things sometimes. Eventually, I graduated from that school and moved on. A few years later, I transferred to a different high school. By then, I'd completely forgotten about the swimming class, forgotten about the camera, forgotten about the recordings. Life was busy. There were other things to think about. Then one day, everything came rushing back. I was scrolling through Facebook when I came across a news article. The headline immediately caught my attention. The person in the article was my old swimming teacher. At first, I assumed it was something harmless. Maybe a retirement announcement. Maybe an award. Maybe some school-related news. Instead, it was something far worse. An investigation had been conducted. Authorities had searched his computer and electronic devices. What they reportedly found was an enormous collection of child sexual abuse material. The scale of it was significant enough that he was ultimately prosecuted and sent to prison. I remember staring at the screen in shock. The more I read, the worse I felt. Suddenly, years of memories began replaying in my head. Moments that had once seemed completely normal now looked different. Conversations, interactions, little details I'd never paid attention to before. Then, one particular memory resurfaced. The swimming class, the camera, the recordings, the explanation about receiving the videos as seniors, and the fact that nobody had ever actually received them. I sat there thinking about it for a long time. Because once that connection formed in my mind, it became impossible to ignore. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe those recordings were never used for anything inappropriate. Maybe they sat forgotten in a storage box somewhere. The truth is, I'll never know. But learning what kind of material investigators found on his computer changed how I viewed that entire experience. It transformed what had once been a slightly odd memory into something deeply unsettling. What bothers me most isn't what I know. It's what I don't know. The uncertainty, the questions, the realization that children naturally trust the adults placed in positions of authority over them. Teachers, coaches, instructors. We assume they're there to help us, to teach us, to keep us safe. As kids, we rarely question their motives. Why would we? They're the adults. They're supposed to be trustworthy. That's why stories like this are so disturbing. Not just because of the crimes themselves, but because they force you to revisit old memories through an entirely different lens. Looking back now, I don't remember the swimming lesson itself nearly as much as I remember that camera sitting quietly beside the pool. I remember the explanation. I remember believing it. And I remember finding out years later that the man behind the camera wasn't the person everyone thought he was. Every once in a while, the memory comes back unexpectedly. usually when I'm thinking about school or childhood. And every time it does, I get the same uneasy feeling. Because sometimes the creepiest stories aren't about ghosts or monsters. Sometimes they're about realizing that the real danger was standing right in front of you the entire time, and nobody knew it yet. Some stories are frightening because of violence. Some are frightening because of mystery. And some stay with you because they reveal a level of pain that is difficult to comprehend. This is one of those stories. I didn't hear it from a newspaper. I didn't hear it online. I heard it because I actually went to school with the person involved. Years have passed, but I still think about it from time to time. The reason it has stayed with me isn't because of what happened alone. It's because of how carefully it was planned, and because of the person who was left behind. The story involved a freshman student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. From what people knew, she had a very difficult relationship with her mother. I wasn't part of their family, and I don't know everything that happened between them. Like most people who heard the story, I only knew pieces of it. But what everyone seemed to agree on was that there was a tremendous amount of anger and resentment there. Whether those feelings were justified or not wasn't really the point. What mattered was that the relationship had become deeply damaged. At some point during her first year of college, she contacted her mother and invited her to come visit. The plan sounded simple. They were supposedly going to meet at the dorm and then go out to lunch together. To an outsider, it might not sound significant. But for a parent whose relationship with their child had been strained, it meant everything. Her mother reportedly believed it was a chance to reconnect, a chance to repair some of the damage, a chance to start over. Anyone who has ever experienced conflict with a family member knows how powerful hope can be. Even when relationships are broken, people often hold on to the belief that things can still improve. That one conversation might fix everything. That one good day might become the beginning of something better. From what I was told, her mother was excited about the visit. She genuinely thought her daughter wanted to spend time with her. Maybe talk. Maybe heal old wounds. Maybe begin rebuilding their relationship. So she made the trip to the campus. She arrived at the dorm building expecting a normal afternoon. What happened instead became something that people still talked about years later. When she reached the dorm room, there was a note on the door. The note told her to come inside. It said her daughter was in the closet. At first glance, that probably didn't seem especially strange. College students leave odd notes all the time. Maybe she was joking. Maybe she was looking for something. Maybe she was trying to surprise her. Whatever her mother thought at that moment, she certainly wasn't expecting what she was about to find. She entered the room. Then, she opened the closet door and discovered that her daughter had taken her own life. The horrifying part wasn't only the death itself. It was that the mother had been deliberately brought there to be the person who found her. That was apparently the plan from the beginning. The invitation, the meeting, the note. Everything had been arranged so that her mother would be the one to walk through the door, the one to open the closet, the one to see it. I've heard a lot of tragic stories over the years, but there's something uniquely disturbing about that level of intention. Because it wasn't simply a suicide. It was a final message, a final act directed toward a specific person. Whether it was motivated by anger, pain, resentment, or something else entirely, only the daughter truly knew. And she's the one person who can never explain it. That's what makes the story so haunting. People naturally try to understand things. We want reasons. We want answers. We want events to make sense. But some stories leave behind nothing except questions. What was she thinking in those final days? Did she ever consider changing her mind? Did she want revenge? Did she want her mother to understand her pain? Did she simply want to make sure she would be found? Nobody can know for certain. The people who heard the story filled in the blanks with their own theories. Some blamed the mother. Some defended her. Some blamed mental illness. Others blamed years of unresolved family conflict. But the truth is that outsiders rarely know the full story of someone else's life. What everyone did know was that 2 lives were permanently changed that day. One ended. The other continued carrying the weight of that memory forever. That's the part I think about most now. Not the student. Not the dorm room. The mother. Imagine waking up that morning believing you were about to have lunch with your child. Imagine driving to campus hopeful that things might finally be improving. Imagine seeing a note that seems ordinary. Then imagine how the next few minutes would change the rest of your life. There are moments that divide people's lives into before and after. For that mother, I can't imagine a clearer dividing line than that. Everything before opening that door. Everything after. Even all these years later, I still remember hearing about it. The shock spread quickly through people who knew her. Nobody expected it. Nobody saw it coming, and that's often the case with tragedies like this. From the outside, people appear to be moving through ordinary days, attending classes, talking with friends, making plans. Then suddenly something happens that changes everything. What has always stayed with me is how sad the entire situation feels. Not scary in the way ghost stories are scary, not frightening in the way crime stories are frightening, just deeply sad. A relationship that never healed. A young life cut short. A mother who arrived expecting reconciliation and instead experienced something unimaginable. Years later, the details still linger in my memory, not because they're sensational, not because they're shocking, but because they remind me how much pain can exist beneath the surface of lives that seem ordinary from the outside. And because sometimes the saddest stories aren't the ones that end with unanswered questions. They're the ones where the answers no longer matter, because everyone involved has already lost far more than they can ever get back. Some of the creepiest stories aren't about ghosts, murderers, or unexplained mysteries. Sometimes they're about realizing how little we truly know about the people around us. This is one of those stories. Compared to many of the other stories people tell, nothing supernatural happened. There wasn't a crime. There wasn't a monster. There wasn't even a mystery in the traditional sense. Yet it has stayed with me for years because of how sudden it was and how completely it changed the way I look at people. At the time, I worked at a bank. Like most workplaces, people naturally formed little groups based on shared interests. One of the things several of us had in common was golf. I wasn't a great golfer, but I enjoyed the sport. One of my coworkers did too. There was also the husband of a woman who worked in our department. He was a big golf fan as well. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him particularly well. My coworker knew him a little better because they'd crossed paths socially a few times before. One week, my coworker and I were talking about a golf show that was coming to town. It was one of those large convention-style events where vendors set up booths, companies showcase new equipment, and golf enthusiasts spend an entire day wandering around looking at things they probably don't need. We were planning to go that weekend. At some point, the woman from our department overheard us talking. She casually suggested that we invite her husband along. It seemed like a perfectly reasonable idea. He liked golf. We liked golf. Why not? So plans were made. The day arrived. I drove to my coworker's house first. From there, we picked up the husband and headed to the convention center together. The entire day was completely normal. Actually, more than normal. It was fun. We wandered through exhibit halls looking at clubs we couldn't afford and gadgets we absolutely didn't need. We watched demonstrations, talked golf, made jokes, the usual stuff. Many of the booths had contests and prize drawings, the kind where you fill out a card and drop it into a box for a chance to win golf trips, equipment, or vacation packages. None of us seriously expected to win anything, so we started treating it like a running joke. Every time we passed another contest booth, we'd fill out another entry form and laugh about which one of us was going to end up winning an all-expenses-paid trip to some luxury golf resort. The husband was right there joking with us, laughing, teasing, participating in all the nonsense. Nothing about his behavior seemed unusual. Nothing seemed wrong. If someone had asked me that day how he was doing, I would have said he seemed perfectly happy. Because that's exactly how he appeared. The day passed quickly. After the show ended, none of us were ready to call it a night. So we went out for dinner. We had a few beers, talked some more, shared stories, complained about work. The kind of conversation people have when they're enjoying themselves and have nowhere else they need to be. Looking back, I can't remember a single moment that stood out. No strange comments, no signs of distress, no emotional breakdowns, no clues, nothing, just three guys having a genuinely good day together. Eventually, the evening came to an end. We drove him home first. He thanked us for the day, got out of the car, and went inside. Then my coworker drove me back to his house. I got into my own car and headed home. The entire day felt like a success, a fun weekend outing, nothing more. I went to sleep that night without giving it another thought. The next morning, everything changed. At around 7 o'clock, the husband went into his garage. He tied a rope to the garage door track, and he took his own life. I remember hearing the news and immediately refusing to believe it. There had to be some mistake. There had to be confusion. We had just spent the entire previous day together. The entire day. Not a brief interaction. Not a passing conversation. Hours. An entire day of talking, laughing, eating, and joking around. Nothing about it had suggested someone who planned to be dead less than 24 hours later. That realization hit me harder than the death itself. Not because I was especially close to him. Because I wasn't, but because it shattered a belief I didn't even realize I had. The belief that severe pain is always visible. That if someone is struggling enough to make a decision like that, there will be signs. Something you'll notice. Something you'll recognize afterward. But there weren't any. At least none that I could see. For years afterward, I replayed that day in my head, looking for clues, looking for moments I might have missed. Did he seem quieter than normal? Did he say something unusual? Did he linger on certain conversations? Did he act differently when we dropped him off? The answer was always the same. No, nothing stood out. And that's what makes the memory so unsettling. Because the version of him we spent that day with appeared completely ordinary. He laughed at the jokes, talked about golf, filled out contest forms, had dinner, had drinks, made plans for things that would never happen. Then, less than 12 hours later, he was gone. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized how common that pattern can be. Some people carry enormous burdens without showing them. Some become experts at hiding pain. Others simply decide not to share it. And occasionally, the people who seem the most normal are fighting battles nobody else can see. That's why this story still stays with me. Not because it's sensational, not because it's mysterious, but because it forced me to confront a difficult truth. You can spend an entire day beside someone, laugh with them, eat with them, talk with them, think they're having a great time, and still have absolutely no idea what they're carrying inside. That realization has never really left me, and honestly, I don't think it ever will. There are plenty of unsolved mysteries in the world. Missing people, strange disappearances, objects that seem to appear where they shouldn't. Most of them eventually get an explanation, maybe not a satisfying one, but an explanation nonetheless. Then there are mysteries like the floating feet of the Pacific Northwest. Because even after years of investigations, scientific studies, and international attention, it remains one of the strangest real-life stories I've ever come across. The mystery began in 2007. At first, it seemed like the kind of story that would appear in the news for a few days, and then disappear. A severed human foot had washed ashore along the coastline near the Seattle and Vancouver region. Disturbing, certainly, but isolated incidents happen. Bodies are occasionally recovered from lakes, rivers, and oceans. Most people assumed authorities would quickly determine who the foot belonged to and how it ended up there. Instead, another foot appeared. Then another, and another. As the years passed, more and more severed feet continued washing up along the coast. Not hands, not arms, not skulls. Feet almost always still inside shoes. That detail somehow made the whole thing even stranger. By the time the mystery gained widespread attention, people were beginning to wonder whether a serial killer was operating somewhere in the region. The idea wasn't entirely unreasonable. Imagine reading headlines about severed feet repeatedly appearing along shorelines. Most people's minds immediately jumped to crime, murder, dismemberment, some kind of horrifying conspiracy. The reality turned out to be far more confusing. Investigators examined the remains. DNA testing was performed whenever possible. Gradually, some of the feet were identified. Several belonged to people who had already been reported missing. Others were eventually connected to individuals whose disappearances had never previously been solved. Yet these identifications didn't make the mystery disappear. If anything, they made it stranger. Because in most cases there was no evidence of foul play, no signs that the victims had been murdered, no signs that someone had intentionally removed the feet, no evidence linking the discoveries together in any criminal way. Some of the identified individuals were believed to have died by suicide. Others were thought to have drowned accidentally. And some simply remained unexplained. What investigators found most surprising was that the feet appeared to come from entirely unrelated people. Different ages, different backgrounds, different circumstances. No single pattern connected them. As more discoveries occurred, researchers began searching for a scientific explanation. Eventually, one theory emerged as the leading possibility. According to forensic experts, when a body remains underwater for an extended period, natural decomposition can weaken the tissues around the ankle. Over time, the foot may separate from the rest of the body. Normally, that wouldn't attract much attention. The unusual factor involves modern footwear. Many athletic shoes contain lightweight materials and trapped air pockets. Some are remarkably buoyant. If a foot remains inside one of these shoes, the entire combination can float. Ocean currents then carry it across long distances until it eventually washes ashore. From a scientific standpoint, the explanation makes sense. In fact, many experts believe it is almost certainly the correct answer. Yet even with that explanation, something about the story continues to unsettle people. Partly because of the imagery. A single shoe washing onto a beach isn't unusual. A shoe with a human foot still inside it is something else entirely. But there's another reason the mystery remains so fascinating. As far as anyone can tell, this phenomenon appears to occur far more frequently in the waters around British Columbia and Washington State than almost anywhere else in the world. That's what keeps people talking about it. Because if decomposition and floating footwear explain everything, why isn't it happening on coastlines everywhere? Why did this particular region become famous for it? Researchers have proposed several possibilities. The geography of the coastline, the patterns of ocean currents, the enclosed nature of certain waterways, the popularity of specific types of athletic shoes, the large amount of marine traffic and recreational boating in the area. All of these factors may contribute. Together, they could create conditions that make detached feet more likely to wash ashore in visible locations. But even if that's true, the story still feels surreal. Imagine taking a walk along a beach. You're looking for shells, maybe watching the waves, maybe enjoying a quiet afternoon. Then you notice a shoe lying near the shoreline. Nothing unusual. Until you look closer and realize a human foot is still inside it. That happened not once, not twice, but over and over again, year after year. Each discovery restarting public fascination with the mystery. What I find most eerie isn't the possibility of crime. In fact, the evidence largely points away from that. What unsettles me is the reminder of how vast and powerful the ocean really is. The sea keeps secrets for years, sometimes decades. People disappear without a trace. Ships sink. Accidents happen. Bodies are carried far from where they entered the water. And occasionally, fragments of those stories return to shore. Not enough to tell us exactly what happened, just enough to remind us that something did. That's why the floating feet mystery continues to capture people's attention. Because even if science has provided a likely explanation, it still feels deeply strange. 24 feet have been discovered so far. Roughly half have been identified. Many questions have been answered, yet many others remain. And every time another foot washes ashore, people find themselves asking the same question all over again. Not who did it, but why this keeps happening here. Because until someone can fully explain that part, the mystery never feels completely solved. He laughed at the jokes, talked about golf, filled out contest forms, had dinner, had drinks, made plans for things that would never happen. Then less than 12 hours later, he was gone. The older I've gotten, the more I've realized how common that pattern can be. Some people carry enormous burdens without showing them. Some become experts at hiding pain. Others simply decide not to share it. And occasionally, the people who seem the most normal are fighting battles nobody else can see. That's why this story still stays with me. Not because it's sensational, not because it's mysterious, but because it forced me to confront a difficult truth. You can spend an entire day beside someone, laugh with them, eat with them, talk with them, think they're having a great time, and still have absolutely no idea what they're carrying inside. That realization has never really left me, and honestly, I don't think it ever will. This is one of those stories that didn't become terrifying until much later. At the time, it was frightening. Looking back, it became something else entirely. What still bothers me is how close we may have come to something far worse without ever realizing it. The story takes place in the fall of 2002. I was living in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Anyone who lived there at the time remembers the atmosphere. The city was on edge. Every news broadcast seemed to carry another update. Every rumor spread quickly. Every strange encounter suddenly felt dangerous. The reason was simple. A serial killer was operating in the area. What later became known as the Baton Rouge serial killer case dominated conversations everywhere. People changed their routines. Women traveled in groups. Families worried whenever loved ones came home late. The fear was real. Nobody knew who the killer was. Nobody knew where he would strike next. And at that point, investigators were still desperately searching for leads. One evening during all of this, my girlfriend called me. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. She sounded terrified, not nervous, not upset. Terrified, she had just left Walmart and was driving home. According to her, a white pickup truck had been following her. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Maybe they happened to be traveling in the same direction. But after several turns, the truck remained behind her. Then she started testing it. She turned down streets she normally wouldn't use. The truck followed. She drove into a cul-de-sac. The truck followed. She exited and took another route. The truck stayed behind her. By that point, she was convinced something wasn't right. And given what was happening in Baton Rouge at the time, her mind immediately went to the worst possibility. Investigators had publicly discussed certain details of the ongoing case. One rumor circulating heavily at the time was that the killer might be driving a white pickup truck. Whether that information was entirely accurate didn't matter. People had heard it. And now my girlfriend was being followed by one. She was panicking. As she explained what was happening, I looked at my best friend and immediately told him we needed to go. We jumped into his car and headed across town. I stayed on the phone with her as much as possible, trying to keep her calm, trying to figure out where she was, trying to intercept her before anything happened. The drive felt much longer than it actually was. Every minute felt important. Every traffic light felt like an obstacle. Eventually, we reached the area where she was driving. A few moments later, we spotted her vehicle. She came off the exit near Dalrymple Drive. And there it was, a white pickup truck directly behind her. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped, because suddenly this wasn't just a frightened girlfriend imagining things. The truck was real, and it was still there. At the time, she was house-sitting for a wealthy relative who lived near the Elsu Lakes. I called her and told her to keep driving. We were right behind the truck now. Whatever happened next, she wasn't alone anymore. A few moments later, she turned into the driveway of the house. The truck continued forward briefly, then stopped. One house before hers, parked along the edge of the lake. I remember staring at it, trying to figure out what to do. My girlfriend pulled into the driveway and immediately got out of her car. She was visibly shaken, almost hysterical, the kind of fear that only comes after prolonged panic. I tried calming her down, reminding her that Elsu's campus was nearby. College students pulled pranks all the time. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe someone had mistaken her car for someone else's. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. At least that's what I was telling her. The truth is, I wasn't entirely convinced myself. My roommate positioned himself near the porch while I decided to approach the truck. Looking back, it probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done, but at the time I was more angry than afraid. I walked toward the driver's side window. As I got closer, I finally saw the driver clearly. The first thing that went through my mind was relief. The man was African American. At the time, law enforcement had publicly indicated that they believed the serial killer was white. So in my mind, that immediately lowered the threat level. I remember thinking, okay, this isn't him. This is just some guy. The driver refused to look directly at me. He seemed uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact. I explained that he'd frightened my girlfriend. I told him he'd probably followed the wrong vehicle after leaving Walmart. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, at least to me. For a few moments, he didn't say much. Then he glanced toward me from the side. A quick look, not quite making full eye contact. Then he started the truck and drove away. That was it. No confrontation, no threats, no explanation. Just a strange encounter that ended as suddenly as it began. Afterward, life moved on. My girlfriend eventually calmed down. We joked about it occasionally, mostly as a story about a creepy misunderstanding during an already frightening time. Months passed. Then, more months. The serial killer investigation continued. Eventually, an arrest was made. And that's when everything changed. I remember seeing the newspapers, seeing the television coverage, seeing the photographs, and then feeling a chill run through my entire body. Because I recognized the face immediately. The man staring back from the front pages was the same man sitting in that white pickup truck. The same man I'd approached. The same man who had followed my girlfriend across town. The same man who had refused to look me in the eye. No evidence had linked him to the murders. The suspect, who had terrified Baton Rouge for months, had finally been identified, and according to investigators, he'd been operating right there while we were all living our normal lives. I remember sitting there staring at the photograph in disbelief, trying to convince myself I was mistaken, trying to tell myself it couldn't possibly be the same person. But it was. There was no doubt. The realization hit hard, because suddenly that strange encounter wasn't just a strange encounter anymore. It became something much darker. To this day, I don't know why he followed her. Maybe it was completely unrelated. Maybe he genuinely mistook her vehicle for someone else's. Maybe he wasn't targeting her at all. Or maybe the situation was far more dangerous than we realized. That's the part I'll never know, and honestly, that's what still bothers me most. Not that we encountered a serial killer, but that for one brief moment, we may have crossed paths with something incredibly dangerous and walked away without ever understanding how close we came. Sometimes, the scariest part of a story isn't what happened. It's what might have happened. And that's a question I'll never be able to answer.